I'm so glad that Thomas doubted, and I'm so glad they sealed the tomb. Hi, I'm David Servant, and this is HeavenWord TV. Well, it's so good to be back together again with you as we continue our chronological study through the entire New Testament. And our study today takes us back to Matthew chapter 27, where we left off last time in verse number 58. And we are just taking our time because we don't want to do this story a disservice. You realize we're studying the three most important days out of all of human history. In fact, as far as we know, it's the three most important days out of all history, even prior to the creation of humanity. And so why rush through this? We've got four accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we're kind of comparing them to get a harmonious picture of what exactly transpired. So I want to start off in Matthew 27. I'm going to reread verse number 58 and just keep on reading as we work our way to the end of this chapter and then on into the resurrection. Verse 58, this man, that's Joseph of Arimathea, went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered it to be given to him. One of the gospel writers tells us, it was Mark's gospel, that Pilate was surprised he was dead so quickly, and he called in the centurion who was standing there, guarding the cross, and asked him, "Is he dead?" And he said, "Yeah, he's dead." And that centurion had just declared, probably minutes before, that Jesus was the Son of God. Okay, so he maybe was a believer as he's talking to Pilate. So in verse number 59, now here's where we start off new material today. And Joseph took the body and he wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and he laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn out of the rock. And he rolled a large stone against the entrance of the tomb, and he went away. We're told in another gospel writer, I think it was Luke, that that the tomb was very, very close to where Jesus was crucified. So where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, and there was a tomb there, and so forth. And so that's where Jesus was laid. So it wasn't a long path or a long journey to get from taking Christ's body down to putting him in that tomb. And then Matthew is very careful to tell us in verse number 61 that Mary Magdalene was there and the other Mary sitting opposite the grave. This is to dispel any kind of rumor that might later spring up, that when Mary and all the women who were there at the resurrection of Christ and saw the empty tomb somehow made a mistake and went to the wrong tomb and just thought it was Jesus' tomb, but it really wasn't. And Mark's gospel and Luke's gospel and John's gospel all point out that same thing. It was very close to where Christ was crucified, and all these women saw the exact place where Jesus was buried. Now, one of the things that Matthew and the other gospel writers don't tell us about the burial of Jesus, John jumps in perhaps decades later and fills in, I believe, some very, very important details that I'm so glad he did. And so we're going to have to jump back over to John chapter 19, verse number 38. After these things, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but a secret one for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate granted permission. Both Mark and Luke tell us that Joseph was a part of the Sanhedrin, but he had not consented to their plan. He was a good and a righteous man, according to Luke's gospel. And so he came and took away his body. And then in verse number 39, here's a surprise. Nicodemus, who had first come to him, Jesus, by night, also came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds weight. I don't know if you ever carried 100 pounds. Probably, most men who are watching this have. Maybe some women have too. I've carried a few 100-pound sacks of potatoes in my day because I used to work in a potato factory years ago when I was going to Bible school, trying to put myself through Bible school, and I got pretty good at carrying those 100-pound sacks. Well, they are massive. So this is, a huge bag of these the myrrh and aloes. And what are they going to do with it? Verse number 40. So they took the body of Jesus, now listen to this verb, and bound it in the linen wrappings. And so reading Matthew and Mark and Luke's gospel, it does say that they wrapped Jesus in the linen wraps, but you don't have the explanation that John gives, bound like a mummy, wrapped up. So the linen wrappings are wrapped around Jesus' arms, around his legs, maybe putting his legs together, I don't know. And along with all those wrappings are 100 pounds of these spices and so forth. Bound it in linen wrappings with the spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. And so if Jesus weighed 180 pounds, now he weighs 280 pounds. And now in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, so there it's close by, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid. We already knew that. Therefore, because of the Jewish day of preparation, that is, it's right before the Sabbath is about to start at sundown there on Friday, since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. Now, why am I bringing that up? Well, it's important because both Luke and John will later tell us that when Peter and John ran to the tomb after they heard Mary's report, that they looked in and they saw the linen wrappings. And then the face cloth was rolled up and put separately in a different location. And so if they saw, this kind of disheveled pile of wrappings that, Jesus came back to life and then he unwound this arm and then unwound this arm and then unwound his leg, Well, that wouldn't have been so impressive. But if they looked and they saw a collapsed, empty cocoon where a body had been, and now that body is completely gone, well, I think that's what they did see, because it says that they looked in, seeing the linen wrappings, and they believed. They knew that his body hadn't been stolen. It wasn't robbers that came in there, rolled away the stone, and unwrapped Jesus and carried his body off. There was this empty cocoon lying there where a physical body, a full-grown man had been previously, a dead body, and now that dead body was there, but the wrappings are still in their former form. Okay? Well, that's, I think, very, very, very significant. And I'm so glad that John makes that so clear in his gospel. Okay? More to say on these important facts. Be right back. All right, welcome back. We are finishing out Matthew chapter 27 as we work our way through the three most important days of all of human history: the death, the burial, the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. And your destiny and my destiny and everyone else's destiny is wrapped up in this story. Isn't it a great tragedy that although many of us have been blessed to hear this story many, many, many times over the years, and how blessed we are, still there are people around the world by the millions and hundreds of millions and even billions who have never heard it one time. And so our ears are blessed, and we need to do what we can so that everyone else hears this amazing message. All right, Matthew chapter 27, and starting in verse number 62. This is new for us. Now, on the next day, the day after the preparation, and then this is the Sabbath day. This is Saturday, which starts at sundown on Friday evening and ends at sundown on Saturday evening. The chief priests and the Pharisees gathered together with Pilate and said, quote, "Sir, we remember that when he was still alive, that deceiver said, quote, 'After 3 days I am to rise again,' end quote." Now, I've questioned, how did they hear that? Because that was not something that Jesus really made public. We know that, according to the gospel records, that he did tell his disciples that on several occasions, although apparently it didn't sink in, and even the angel has to remind the women at the tomb on the resurrection morning of what Jesus said. Hey, don't you remember? Here's what he said. He would rise on the third day. But somehow, these chief priests and Pharisees know it. Now, it could have trickled down from Jesus' disciples on to a few others and made it to them, although, I just wonder about that. Jesus did one time publicly say, "Destroy this temple and in 3 days I'll rebuild it." In fact, that was brought up at his trial before the Sanhedrin. But again, nobody seemed to catch the idea that he was talking about his own body. Okay? So where'd they get that? I don't know. nobody knows for sure. But I have to wonder whether or not that wasn't something that Judas told them as well, that if you're going to do away with Jesus, you need to make sure that there's no deception afterwards by his disciples. Man, Judas was certainly the quintessential wolf in sheep's clothing, wasn't he? Okay, so again, I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there for your consideration. But they feel they need to take some kind of action in order to prevent this potential deception that they see on the horizon. And so in verse number 64 of Matthew 27, therefore give orders for the grave to be made secure until the third day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal him away and say to the people, quote, he has risen from the dead, end quote, and the last deception will be worse than the first. Well, these guys are the ones who are the deceivers, and they're self-deceived into thinking that Jesus was nobody but a deceiver. I mean, it's just layer upon layer of pathetic information here talking about them. Now, although I feel bad that they were so deceived, in one sense, I have kind of a perverse sense of gladness in that they took this precaution, because had they not taken this precaution, then no doubt there would have been people who accused the disciples of stealing his body away and saying that, he was risen from the dead. So I'm glad for their skepticism. I'm glad they're trying to keep Jesus in that grave. But when you're trying to keep God down, you're up against, forces that are pretty big, all right? Trying to keep God behind a stone when God says, I'm going to get out of there, you're wasting your time. I'm also kind of in a funny sense, I'm glad that Thomas, remember doubting Thomas, who we'll eventually read about? I'm kind of glad he doubted. He says, I won't believe until I put my hand in his side and see the nail prints in his hands. Well, you have no doubt then that when Thomas ultimately was convinced, this skeptic was convinced, that makes the whole story more believable for us. It wasn't just a bunch of, charismatic Christians who just believe anything that anybody tells them, and so now this wild story has been concocted. No, we have some people that, are attempting to use a little bit of reasonable skepticism here. I mean, how many times do you hear of someone being raised from the dead? And just because somebody gives you the report, even if it's a good friend, why would you believe that? The reason Jesus was, reprimanded Thomas for his doubt is because Jesus himself told all of them, I'm going to rise again on the third day. Okay, so Thomas didn't believe the word of Jesus, and that was his fault. And so anyways, continuing on the story in Matthew 27, verse number 65, Pilate said to them, you have a guard. Go, make it as secure as you know how. So he gave them some authority. And the guard, Roman soldiers. And they went and made the grave secure, and along with the guard, they set a seal on the stone. I don't know what that was all about, setting a seal on the stone, but they did it anyways. And so there you have it. There's the grave secure. There's the grave guarded. Now we come to the end of Matthew chapter 27 and on into Matthew chapter 28, the final chapter of Matthew's gospel. And I only wish that there were 20 more chapters, because there are so many things that occurred and transpired after the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It just doesn't seem Matthew, Mark, Luke, or even John have given it the time and the detail I wish they would have. They're all truncated to some degree, and you have to really put them all together in order to make some sense out of it, because they could even seem, the reports of what happened right after Christ was resurrected, they could seem contradictory. Years ago when I was a pastor, I spent, I think, about 5 or 6 or maybe even 7 years just harmonizing every Easter the components of the Easter story. And I eventually ran out of stuff to say. That's one of the trials of being a pastor, coming up with new Easter sermons every year that nobody's heard before. But I put all the stories together and tried to piece them, so that they all harmonized. And if you just read Matthew's gospel, for example, what we're about to read here now, you'd think that Mary came to the tomb and stayed there one time and then saw the angels and then saw Jesus. But you read other gospels and you realize she came, she left, she came back again. And she may have left and come back again. I don't know, okay? But it's going to be very, very exciting now as we look upon this most important part of Matthew's gospel, the story of Jesus' resurrection. I'll be right back. All righty, welcome back. We're finishing out Matthew chapter 27 now, and just getting into the edge of Matthew chapter 28. Matthew devotes an entire chapter. Of course, he didn't write it in chapters and verses, but it's divided up that way. And so it's also divided that way for Mark and for Luke, whereas John gives so much material after the resurrection that those who divided up the Bible into chapter and verse gave him 2 chapters worth. He definitely has the lion's share of the information about the resurrection. So we're going to be jumping around a little bit here and doing what we can do to harmonize these different accounts. Matthew 28 and verse number 1. Let's just read one verse and then look at what Mark and Luke and John say. Now, after the Sabbath, as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to look at the grave. And so there you have 2 women that Matthew mentions, and they were coming to the grave of Jesus, and it's as it began to dawn. Now, what do you think of as beginning to dawn? Well, I think of as the sun is still behind the horizon, but it's getting brighter in the eastern sky. That's what I think. Let's look at Mark's Gospel, chapter 16 and verse number 1. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, Matthew called her the other Mary, and Salome. Well, there's a third woman whom Mark mentions. Well, why didn't Matthew mention that third woman? Because they all have to make choices as to what they're going to include and what they're not going to include, okay? And so that's not a contradiction. We've just harmonized the two gospel accounts. And it says that they brought spices so that they might come and anoint him. Then verse number 2. Very early on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb when the sun had risen. And so how does that harmonize with what Matthew said? Well, Matthew said when it began to dawn. So maybe Matthew's definition of the beginning of the dawn is right after the sun breaks over the horizon. How about that? Okay? It doesn't contradict what Mark wrote. They can easily be harmonized. Now jump over to Luke's Gospel. Luke chapter 23, verse number 56, the last verse of that chapter. Then they, the woman, returned and prepared spices and perfumes. And on the Sabbath they rested according to the commandment. So they rested from Friday evening, sundown, Saturday evening, sundown. Verse number 1 of Luke 24. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they came to the tomb bringing the spices which they had prepared. Okay, so does that contradict Matthew and Mark? They all use different expressions. Early dawn, as it began to dawn, and when the sun had risen, okay? But there's enough light for them to see. Now, one last little look here at John's Gospel, because John, he's the toughest to harmonize. Verse number 1 of John chapter 20. Now, on the first day of the week, and may I point out that they all agree it was the first day of the week, okay? It was Sunday morning. On the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene, well, that harmonizes perfectly with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but he doesn't mention any other woman. Mary Magdalene came early to the tomb. Now, listen to this. While it was still dark, and saw the stone already taken away from the tomb. So, John says it was still dark, whereas everyone else said basically the dawn had broken, the sun had risen. Well, how do you harmonize that? Well, there's lots of ways to harmonize it. It can still be dark right after the sun has risen. It's going to get considerably lighter than what it was just before the sun rises, but it still could be considered dark. Or, as some have suggested, it's possible that Mary, because John doesn't mention the other Mary or Salome or any other women for that matter, if you read John's Gospel by itself, you would think it was Mary Magdalene only by herself going to the tomb. And so is it possible that she by herself got up while it was still dark and went to the tomb, and she saw that the stone had been taken away, and that's all she saw. She just got the tomb, it's still dark, and oh my goodness, the stone's been moved. And she would conclude, somebody's rolling away the stone. She hasn't seen an angel at this point in time. There's been nothing supernatural going on. She just recognizes, oh my goodness, in the dark I can see that the stone has been rolled. And so what does she do? She does what Luke also said she did, but doesn't tell it in the exact same order. Verse number 2 of John 20. And so she ran and came to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved. We've already heard that expression, probably John, the author of this gospel. And said to them, they have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. See, so it would seem that if she had seen an angel, as we see in the synoptic gospels, by that point in time, she wouldn't have said those exact words to Peter and John. She'd have said, and I saw an angel, and here's what the angel explained. But she's concluding that somehow they've moved the body of Jesus. Okay? And so that's when, of course, Peter and John run to get to the tomb to investigate for themselves, and they see the very same thing. Again, no angels, no resurrected Jesus. But they do venture now inside of the tomb of Christ, and they see the linen wrappings lying there with the face cloth put off onto one side. And that's when it says, John says, they believed because they knew there had been a resurrection because of the cocoon, the empty cocoon that they saw of those linen wrappings. Okay? And of course, Mary didn't just stay back at that point in time. She probably ran around and got her friends, and then they all ran back to the tomb and got there around the same time that Peter and John were done with their investigation. And when Peter and John leave, that's when supernatural things start happening. Okay? And so putting it all together, you can piece it together by looking at all four accounts and saying, these are not contradictory, these are harmonious, and I need to figure out how they all fit together. Because they're so truncated, they're trying to get across to us, all of them are trying to get across to us the salient points, the most important points. All right, I can't wait to talk about this more next time. We're going to get deep, deep, deep into the resurrection of Christ. So, see you then. God bless.
Visit us online at HeavenWord.tv to view this and every episode of HeavenWord TV for free. Watch the behind-the-scenes videos. Read other teaching articles, books, and devotionals written by David Servant, and learn about other exciting ministries that David directs. All this and more is at HeavenWord.tv.